Empire of Ashes, a novel of Alexander the Great, by Nicastro. Dedicated with love to my wife, Marianne, sine qua non. A note on units of measure. This book includes a mixture of ancient and modern units of measure. For the sake of convenience, modern units are used when they were more or less similar to their ancient counterparts, e.g., feet, hours, months. Verisimilitude has been served by including a number of antique units that are common in the relevant historical sources. Most prominent here are the stadae, a Greek unit of distance approximately equivalent to 600 modern feet, and from which our word stadium is derived, and the parasang, a Persian unit equivalent to the distance a person could walk in an hour. On average, the latter equaled 30 Greek stadia, or 3 1/4 modern miles. An army of the time could cover about 6 parasangs in a day. The common monetary unit is the Athenian Drachma, which is equivalent in value to 6 obols. The superordinate units are the mina, worth 100 drachmas, and the talent, equaling 6,000 drachmas. The daric is a common non-Greek unit of currency, a gold coin minted by the Persians worth about 26 drachmas. We know that a decent house in a suburb of Athens in the 4th century BC would set the buyer back 500 to 1,000 drachmas, or 5 to 10 minas. A gallon of olive oil, more than 3 drachmas. A good pair of shoes, about 10 drachmas. A healthy slave, 300 or 500 drachmas. Still, for various reasons, expressing the value of a drachma in today's currency is not as straightforward as finding modern equivalents for, say, distance. According to an oft-cited rule of thumb, the wage for the average skilled laborer in classical Athens was 1 or 2 drachmas a day. A talent, therefore, works out to the equivalent of almost 20 years of work, or in modern terms something like $1 million. The treasury of 120,000 talents Alexander is said to have plundered at Persepolis was therefore equivalent to some 720 million man-days of labor. This amounts to real money, even in U.S. government terms. As for the calendar, the reader will notice there are no absolute days given for the events depicted here. This is due to the simple fact that no universal calendar existed until recent times, and arguably does not exist even today, given that the Chinese, Muslim, and Jewish calendars are still in use. Instead, years were designated either by counting the years since some important event or on the basis of who held important magistracies. At that time, in Athens, years were named for the so-called eponymous archons. Alexander, for instance, was born in the year of Alpenes' archonship, known otherwise as July 356 to June 355 BC. The court case described here takes place in the month of Paianopsion, the Attic equivalent of October, in the year of Caphisodorus 323 BC. The events recounted in the trial of Machon occur in the years immediately before and during the campaign of Alexander, spring 334 through spring 323. Prologue. Olympias examined the face in her bronze mirror. Such dull features, she thought, frowning at her saffron-tinted reflection, believing she saw it in the trial of every Epirite winter suffered by her forebears. She narrowed her examination to her eyes, tracing a flicker of interest in them as she regarded themselves. "Yes, those are fine," she said, "but the rest, hopeless." Before her, laid out like military assets on a battlefield, were the tools of a despised but lucrative trade. Depilatories, astringents, demulcents, emollients, pomades, perfumes, bombs. Next to a jar filled with a Syrian unguent of beef fat, thyme, and seagull droppings, she had a flask of Corinthian warming ointment, made from sesame oil and turpentine. There was an Egyptian face powder that smelled of oleander, and was milled so fine it flowed like liquid between her fingers. Though its color was perfectly white, it rouged her cheek when she applied it. She also tried a curious device invented by a Syracusan that, with a single click, cut all the hairs of the eyebrow to a uniform length. These were, in addition to the usual natron powder foundation of metallic mercury, kohl for the eyes, chervil for the breath, all the attributes of an expensive courtesan. No respectable woman, installed in domestic glory within her walls, would need to create a seductively wan complexion by daubing her skin with lead, or fake a blush with ochre pencils. Such freedom was the gift of ignorance. And so that afternoon, Olympias, consort of the king of Macedonia, daughter of the royal house of Epirus, initiate advanced grade in the holy mysteries of Demeter and Cabiroi and the Great Mother, painted herself like a lowly flute girl. This wasn't necessary in past years. From the moment of their first meeting, Philip had shown himself vulnerable to her attraction. They had encountered each other on Samothrace, confronting the celebrated mysteries, but Olympias presented herself to him as a very solvable enigma. When they first married, he would interrupt his endless campaigns and sieges to steal nights with her. An heir was eagerly anticipated, and yet, strangely, had not come. This delay she first attributed to her tendency to climax early, often several times before her partner could lumber up his own and relatively brief contribution. Her pleasure may have acted to drive off the male humors necessary to the process of conception, her doctors told her. So she held herself back. Yet something still seemed to go awry. Something that impinged or intruded upon the process. Too often the king left her bed at the earliest courteous instants, lips moving silently, a slash of annoyance across his face. "Too much muttering, not enough mothering," she said, as she mixed the coal with its little spoon. The result was a maddeningly empty cradle. Philip came to her just as she finished the preparations. There was a faint look of irritation on his face, the kind he wore when state business pulled him away from dice games and drinking parties. He hardly looked at her until she turned to him, her face glazed dazzling white, like a funeral jar, her cheeks like puddles of dried blood. "You look like a streetwalker," he said. "Shall I take it off?" she asked, rising. Not quite by accident, her gown fell open. The look of gray distraction finally left Philip's face as he eyed what he saw there. "No, I suppose not." When he touched her, it was always the same, like a traveler always taking the identical route through a half-understood country. His first move was to denude her left shoulder and seize the breast. He did so. She kept her eyes on him, shifting her weight precisely in time with the force of his attentions. Philip never had trouble spearing generals and envoys with his eyes. When he was alone with Olympias, though, he could never hold her gaze. She was never so shy, searching his full, square, deceptively kind face, taking the measure of him. This inevitably distracted him, until she found herself turned around. He was pushing her down from behind. The back is still your best side, and most affordable, I would think. 3 obols ago, if that's all you've got, she replied, tight-lipped. He yanked up her gown, regarded the cleaved haunch as it swelled down from her hips and rounded off at that swale of lubricious womanhood. A mound of true sweetness, he thought, though with the cloying softness of her sex, that quicksand prospect of letting him sink slickly away until he could go no further. But this was like sleeping on a too-soft pillow after weeks on campaign, an adjustment he was just too impatient to make, so he took the other road. She started at this, turning to face him. Camp-style buggery was not the object of her afternoon's work. But if you prefer, we might have a special price on the racehorse, she said, coaxing him back onto the coach. Now here is something, he thought, as he settled in jockey position athwart him. She settled in jockey position athwart him. The gown had been disposed of, and she was looking down at him through tumbling flutes of sweet-smelling hair, breasts standing forward and free, that same vaguely appraising look on her face. The later annoyed him, but not much in the soft vice. She turned away as she commenced to rock, not in passion, but to avoid his breath, which stank of sprats and whatever wine painted his throat. "Don't I bounce lately?" she asked him. "Expertly. It began pleasantly enough. The kind of friction between them, though, was rarely the right kind, and soon both became frustrated. She could easily have come and dared not. He wanted to have it done with, but couldn't. The position was unique, yet impractical for him, since he needed to use his hips. At last he half rose from the cushions, bucking into her from below until he finished. Olympias grasped him with her thighs like a real rider, her body first hardening and then pouring herself out around him. Then she lay to his side, one leg still slung over him. Monarchy's duty done, the king planted a peremptory kiss on the top of her head and moved to slip away. He was restrained by her rigid cocked leg. "Let me go," he said. "I have business." "Tossing dice, no doubt." "The worth of my pursuits is not for you to judge. Let me up." "And what about this business?" He opened his mouth to reply, but was distracted by the peculiar sight of her rubbing her cheek against the royal tulle. Pulling back, she revealed a coat of white lead transferred from her face to the bulb. She was smiling with childish delight at this, her cheek now covered with a pink impasto of ochre, metal, and spunk. "Damn you, woman! What are you doing to me?" She used her fingers to smear the rest of him with her paint. "So squeamish. See, I've made a statue of your best feature." "Chamberlain! Pherodepanos! Fetch water!" he cried. She propped herself up on an elbow, like a drinker at a party. "Oh, Philip, why do you have such contempt for me?" The chamberlain opened the door and entered, but was frozen in his tracks by Olympia's withering stare. Then he retreated. She turned back to Philip. "You are too proud, sir. Your serpent is pretty, but so is mine." He felt her root beneath his head and pull something from her under the pillow. She was now dangling a long, colorful object in front of his face. Looking closely, he met the beaded eyes of a small snake. "Sisyphus, salute your king," she addressed the snake. Sisyphus opened his mouth, revealing a blue interior and a pair of needle-thin fangs. Philip shot up to his feet, dumping Olympias on the floor. "By the gods, you should live in a cage. I should send you back to that tree in Dodona you fell from." "My love, wait," she laughed. "He's harmless, just a little baby." He slammed the bedroom door behind him. An hour later, Philip was slouching beside his general Parmenium on a drinking couch. The room was small and deliberately hard to find, adjoining the back of the portico that overlooked the flats of the king's burgeoning capital. Now deep in his cups, Philip was imagining what it would take to fill Pella's lagoon with his very own navy. The Athenian contractors pay 1.50 for each vessel, not counting pay and supplies, Parmenium told him. Perhaps we might shave a little off the pay. The prospect of cheap, boundless military capability made Philip's eyes shine like an impatient bridegroom's. Dangerous. The Athenians have motivated men at the oars, even citizens. Parmenium broke off. Lowering his cup, Philip saw why. Olympias had found them. His wife was standing there, clearly and unabashedly naked. She had done nothing to clean herself after their labors, her eyes caked with mineral black, her cheeks still smeared with the royal seed. Philip glanced at Parmenium. The officer's eyes were prudently lowered, but a smile played on his lips. Philip could think of nothing to say until he finally sighed. "Woman, you are an affliction." Olympias was looking up and away from them, her arms raised. "Rejoice, O Macedon!" she cried. The king opened his mouth to call the chamberlain, but the words died in his throat. Small objects were cascading down from between Olympia's thighs. They were hard, round. Each was propelled from her in force, bouncing and rolling on the tiles. "I am an oak. I have conceived in Zeus." Stunned, Philip could only watch as the shining, growing heap of acorns collected at the feet of his queen. One. What soon gets old? Gratitude. Aristotle. The day broke cold on the empty square. Lying in the shadow of Hymettus, Swallow watched the autumn sun rise over the ridge. A shining wedge descended to light the plumes of stoking smoke from the factories, then the bronzed incrustations of the Acropolis. As the market stalls opened, a mantle of haze kicked up by thousands of feet settled over the town, warming him with its familiarity. Filing past him, on their way into the market, his fellow Athenians, bless them, looked down with contempt upon his prone body. He got up when the first beams reached the pavement. Shucking his blanket, he rose to empty his bladder through his morning semi-rigidity. The market girls grimaced, turning away from his baggy, tufted nakedness, but he was long past caring if he impressed those snoots. "Pay attention to the shoes, sister," he yelled at one of them. "These aren't cheap shoes." Relieved at last, he took up the blanket again and dressed himself. Since it was a court day, he arranged it in what he considered formal style, wrapping it around full length and with the fringe thrown statesmanlike over his left shoulder. That done, and looking quite philosophic, he thought, he reached back and stuck his left forefinger into his anus. Rooting about, he found the silver tetradrachm he kept there for safekeeping. "Good morning, little owl," he hailed the coin. "Let the slave girls turn their noses up at that." True, he favored the northwest corner of the market to spend the night because it caught the first sunshine of the morning, and the crossroad altar gave some privacy from the road. Equally important, though, was that it was a good spot from which to tell the mood of the day. After years of observation, he could tell much from the atmosphere in the very first moments of the morning. The speed and disposition of human bodies, their numbers, the presence of magistrates, all were clues. By the throngs that were already pouring in, momentous events seemed afoot. Macedonians, notable for their capes and their taste for vulgar display of gold in public, were much in evidence. Cadets were filing from their barracks on the slope of the Acropolis, fanning out toward the gates of the city. Shoppers seemed weighed down with more than one day's burden of groceries. Their demeanor, he saw, was very anxious. There was a wine seller's stall east of the Sacred Way that opened early. The place sold most of its good product, the Chian dry whites and Thasian blacks, in bulk to provisioners coming in from far places. The proprietor would also mix up a 3-measure jug of local stuff for an obol, which was good enough to take the edge off the morning chill. The only thing to beware was his use of dirty water. Swallow had once tucked into a cup of sweet Attic that had been mixed with effluvia from the tannery next door. He was on his second cup when his friend Deuterus saluted him. "Swallow, have you heard the news? Antipater is banging your wife?" Deuterus gave a weak smile and pulled out a little cup he kept under his clothes. Swallow poured out 2 fingers' worth for him. "Big trial today. It's listed right in the middle of the DS, and it's not just some crappy inheritance case." Deuterus downed the wine, looked around nervously. Swallow had been going to the courts with him for years, had shared the cup with him countless times, and yet never known him to show the slightest effect of drink. He was always sober, always with that subtly hunted look. The reason may have had to do with marrying a girl far too personable and pretty. While this seemed inviolable to Swallow, and indeed would to most men, Deuterus had continued to be out of the house virtually all the time since his marriage. Even then, he still seemed to be keeping a permanent watch on the streets, as if expecting to see his wife humiliate him by going out in public. Swallow poured out another 2 fingers. "Tell me why I'm buying you drinks, Deuterus, when you live in a nice house up on the hill." "The defendant is Machon." "Alexander's boy?" "The same. And the prosecutor is Aeschines." "What? He's back?" "Apparently. The charges are betrayal of the public trust and impiety, or something." "Sounds like Aeschines. But he must be very long in the tooth by now. And to come back from such a long way, as his friend was standing and thinking and not drinking, Deuterus tipped more wine from Swallow's cup into his own. A trial like that has big stakes. What to try somebody from Alexander's staff with his regent's army breathing down our necks? It's stupid if you ask me, dear Deuterus. Antipater could bring his rabble right down here. What can the old man have in his mind? The other issued a resonant snort through his nose as he drank. Or maybe that's the whole point, Swallow went on. If Machon ran afoul of the boy, maybe Aeschines thinks his indictment will keep us in Antipater's good graces. It seems like a big risk to me, anyway. Nothing can stop those Macedonian dogs. Just to be safe, we should probably vote guilty if we get on the jury, right? Deuterus looked around furtively. You asking me? Who else is standing here? Sure, guilty, I guess. There he stands, an adept of Thebes herself. Swallow laughed, clapping his friend on the shoulder. Athenian justice is safe with men like you, Deuterus. They made their way across to the courthouse. There already seemed to be a throng of men milling outside, though only a few could have been eligible for service. The spectators' box would be filled today. Good luck, said Swallow loudly, and then leaning into Deuterus's ear whispered, Remember the verdict. They parted, each proceeding to the entryway designated for his tribe. Swallow to Kekprops, Deuterus to Erechtheus. Just inside, the former dropped his journeyman's tag in the box. The Archon's assistant immediately fished the tag out, scrutinizing the name. You again! The state can't afford your civic mindlessness unless we start charging you to fumigate the place. I resent that, Swallow replied, adjusting his blanket in a manner reminiscent of one of Demosthenes' dramatic pauses. This got a big laugh from the other jury candidates. Get out of my sight, the secretary cried, dropping the tag back in the box. Before the allotment began, Swallow encountered someone he'd find less welcome on the jury than little Deuterus. Eteocles of Chaeronea saw him at the same moment, registering his recognition with a scowl. At that, of course, Swallow had to go over to welcome him. My dear Eteocles, it's no surprise to see you here for this event, and not alone, it seems. Eteocles was standing with two other well-knitted nobles, all sweetly redolent of leather and horseflesh. Neither of them would even look at Swallow. With proper reverse snobbery, Swallow despised anyone who rode in on a horse, the conveyance of the old guard, tyranny-loving, fish-feasting, sympathetic, leisured precocracy. It is a surprise to see you, Eteocles sneered, when your beloved Demosthenes is not party to the case. But your beloved Aeschines is, and after so many years away, don't we all envy the sweet ooze of his oratory, like some unglued beehive? I can hardly wait. May you enjoy the spectacle, dear Swallow. Who knows how long such events will open to persons like yourself? And may I return your sentiment? I, for one, would miss the charming futility of your ambitions. Before their exchange could begin its usual descent into undisguised insult, the jury selection began. The magistrate at the door forwarded the box of juror tags to the junior archon in charge of the allotment. The tags went into the rows of slots in the face of the machine, and the mixed black and white cubes poured down the metal tube mounted on its side. As the secretary drew tokens from the bottom of the tube, their color either nominated or rejected the respective row of tags. The drawing was repeated 10 times. That made 50 citizens randomly chosen from each tribe, so the jury would have, alas, only 500 members. Swallow was hoping for a 1,000 or even a 2,000-man allotment, as the really big juries tended to have a far more refreshingly democratic rowdiness. After the last name was read out, Swallow couldn't restrain his impulse to tease Eteocles. "It seems the gods favored me today, my dear friend, and you, I presume, will return to your barn." "I will be with the spectators. Respect your good fortune, Swallow." This was an unexpectedly gracious response, and it made Swallow ashamed he had gloated. Two. The trial was held in the courthouse chamber with most room for spectators. The jurors were knotted outside, each holding a short wooden staff painted the same red color as the door lintel. Swallow had just turned in his token to the clerk when he looked back and saw his friend waving a red staff at him from the back of the crowd. Both had made the jury. Swallow saved a spot on a front row bench for Deuterus. Since the benches were covered only with straw, naive jurors expended the precious minutes before the session began, fetching cushions to sit on. But Swallow knew the key to comfort in the courtroom was to forget the rear and tend to the stomach. The hour was already late to complete such an important trial. Most likely the verdict would be delivered after sundown, and all would be going home in the dark. Though to his home, fortunately, Swallow did not have far to go. In anticipation of the inevitable languors, he carried in the fold of his blanket a hunk of white cheese and a handful of olives. Seeing this bounty, Deuterus nodded his appreciation, then opened his cloak to flash a loaf of good bread. Now if they only allowed wine! The clerk tried to gavel the room to order. Since this was an Athenian court, the task took several attempts. Some bumpkin had sneaked a sick lamb to the proceedings, no doubt hidden under his cloak, which bucked free and scampered under the benches. There was some commotion as the baying animal was cornered. The uproar gave the Scythian bailiffs, who looked like vain bears in their animal skins and city jewelry, a relished opportunity to shove people. The lamb was ejected over the vigorous objections of its owner, who also insisted on leaving despite the fact that the doors were sealed, with no one permitted to enter or exit. The dispute was resolved by the application of a club to the juror's head. Out cold, the man was returned to his seat, hopefully to revive in time to cast his ballot. All this time Swallow kept his eye on Aeschines, who was seated on the prosecutor's bench to the right of the magistrate's dais. The old master was sitting very straight, eyes moving over some scribblings before him, lips moving slightly, as if in final rehearsal of a prepared speech. He seemed fit for a man of nearly 70 years. His skin glowed like a ploughman's in summer, a consequence, no doubt, of a recent sea voyage from his academic posting on Rhodes. His tan skin set off his abundance of snowy hair, and a gleaming white chiton adorned by a purple fringed girdle. Sitting there, serenely indifferent to the plight of the loose lamb, he seemed to be playing the role of a character who slept very well at night, yet had very important manners weighing on his silver-crested brow. Or at least that's how it seemed to Swallow, who was old enough to remember Aeschines' former career on the stage, specializing in kings, gods descendant, and honored corpses lying in state. The gavel sounded again, this time swung by the presiding judge. The seat was filled, surprisingly, not by a junior functionary, but the King Archon himself. The only trials he presided over were supposed to involve special heinousness, such as parricide and profanation of the mysteries. "Isn't that Polyclitus?" Deuterus whispered, noting the same irregularity. "It is. So they brought Aeschines back and put Polyclitus in charge. Somebody has a great interest in seeing this Machon put down. Maybe we should change our verdict." "Silence in the courtroom," Polyclitus commanded. "The clerk will read the indictment. Hear, O Athens! This court is convened according to all proper custom under the due supervision of those so charged and here present before a jury properly appointed and in the names of Themis bearer of scales and Athena may she protect us, and of Agliaurus, Hestia, Enyo, Ares, Enyalios, Thallo, Oxo, Hegemon, Heracles, and the spirits of wheat, barley, vines, and figs, and the boundaries of Attica. We gather here now, on the second day of Paeanoption, under the archonship of Siphus Adorus, to hear and judge the citizen, Machon, son of Agathon, of the Demi Scambonidae, on the charges so listed." The clerk had to wrestle through his notes, which seemed to be out of order. There was silence in the room now, and a general pricking up of ears and lightening of backsides, with the sole exception of the man who brought the lamb, who slumped down from the bench and hit the floor with a thud. No one helped him. "The charges are, first, that he did contravene the instructions given him by the assembly 12 years ago, when he set out on campaign with the god known in his human guise as Alexander III of Macedon, and second, that he did commit impiety before said god, who was deified by decree of the assembly of the people on the 16th Metageddonum of last year. These are the charges." "Who brings the indictment?" asked Polyclitus. "By the gods I bring it," said Aeschines, rising to his cue. His voice had a depth typical of actors, but with an oratory's urgency. It broke on the audience like a crash of falling boulder, abrupt, inescapable. "Begin your statement. Start the water." The clerk pulled the stopper out of the water clock. At the outset, the prosecution had the floor for 20 minutes, with additional time at the discretion of the Archon. Blatherers and incompetents were given little indulgence. Aeschines, to be sure, would be given all the time he wanted. "Athenians, I stand before you today after a long time away. In those years among foreigners I had much opportunity to observe the ways of other people, and to weigh their respective features in light of what I know as a citizen of this city. And in that time I never lost faith in the basic superiority of our arrangements, no matter how sadly abused, and in the inherent repugnance to our people of indecency and injustice, no matter how ubiquitous those vices may now seem. And I appear today with complete confidence that you will again judge rightly as I offer you the facts. Please understand that I make such charges with reluctance, and have so only sparingly in the past, because I do not believe our city is well served by frivolous or malign actions. These procedures, on the contrary, should be reserved only for cases of utmost seriousness, and on the clearest evidence, as I know you will agree, is the case with our friend Machon. I know this because it is understood throughout this city that verdicts on trials of this type, that is, of impiety, have grave implications not only for the accused but for every citizen, as the gods do not discriminate between the impious man and those who abet him. In this sense, it is our entire city that is on trial. You do not need to be reminded that there is dangerous talk afoot, and that those who have led us into disaster in the past have raised their heads again since the death of Alexander. And given that a foreign army is but a few days' march from Attica, and that the emissaries of that foreign power are present here today, I am bound by my duty and love of my native city to remind her that her responsibilities are to herself first. As I present these truths to you, your job will be merely to perceive. For to perceive what Machon has done, you will also judge him correctly. As Aeschines referred to Antipater's emissaries, his eyes flicked toward the spectators' gallery. Swallow could easily pick the Macedonians out of the crowd. They were the beardless ones, real Alexander-style buzz cuts, with the expressions of mulish superiority on their rustic faces. Doubleness, they were thinking, there would be no reason for such cumbersome litigation in Pella. Just a secret order passed to an underlying, and thence to some eager, doe-eyed thugs just in from the hinterlands. They did things differently there. The first charge I will address is of Machon's impiety. I am certain you recall the resolution of the assembly not long ago in response to a message from Alexander requesting divine honors. I am also told, for I was not there, that debate on the measure was as uncontentious as any ever put before that body. Even Demosthenes supported it, albeit with the usual contempt for men of quality, saying, "Let Alexander be Zeus's boy, and Poseidon's too, for good measure." The measure passed by simple acclamation. Read the resolution, please. The timekeeper stopped the clock, and the clerk read the city's conferral of divine honors on Alexander. Swallow well remembered the day that resolution passed. It was indeed uncontentious, though not due to any particular love for Alexander, whom city democrats had taken to calling the boy. Many of them had spent the last decade hoping with every fiber of their bearings that he go down in defeat in Persia. Clouds of birds and herds of sheep and goats were sacrificed to enlist the gods on behalf of the Persian king Darius. Faced with the boy's demand for godhood with the army of his lackey, Antipater poised, as it was that very day, to enforce his adolescent whims. There seemed to be little choice but to indulge him. As it was, most members of the assembly considered the request something of a joke, a cry for respect Alexander couldn't earn from the Greeks with 1,000 victories. Swallow did not oppose it. As I have said, I was not in the city when this measure passed. I cannot speak to whether the motives behind its approval were sincere or cynical. I can only say that by any measure, whether in glory under arms or in the patronage of the arts, or by the basic virtue of character to which all men should orient like sailors to the pole star, Alexander deserved such honors. Athenians, do we not owe our very city to the magnanimity? Twice the Macedonians could have laid waste to Athens. First, after Chaeronea, when the disaster I long warned of finally came to pass, and Demosthenes, incidentally, was hightailing it from the battlefield. Recall that Philip could have continued south and exacted our annihilation. But instead of invasion, we received our prisoners back without claim of ransom, and the ashes of our fallen soldiers. Prince Alexander himself came to us as an emissary of peace. The second time was after excuse me. The second time was after Philip was assassinated, and some in the assembly argued the time was ripe to throw off the Macedonian yoke. Though to my limited knowledge of husbandry, no yoke has ever worn so lightly as the one Philip fashioned for us. To be sure, it is our eagerness for action that makes us as deeply as our democracy, as Herodotus wrote. It is easier to incite 30,000 Athenians to war than a single Spartan. Thus it has been, and thus it probably shall always be. Alexander, no longer prince but king, appeared in Boeotia with his army, and besieged Thebes, as is all too typical of reprobates and cowards. The nerve of the anti-Macedonian rabble broke in the face of determined force. Thebes was destroyed. It cannot be denied. But Alexander shared his father's distaste for vengeance against Athens. He invaded Persia instead, and upon his subjugation of that kingdom he returned to us the figures of the tyrannicides stolen by Xerxes. Many of you passed those statues on your way to this chamber this morning, though I wonder how many of you pause to consider to whom we owe such relics for our patrimony. Did Alexander deserve divinity? For Athens' sake, who deserved it more? I remember Alexander's embassy after Chaeronea, though I had met the prince before as a boy in his father's court in Pella. That occasion did not prepare me for the full splendor of his person. At 18 years old, his beauty made slaves of men and women. His hair was fair and bright like the mane of a lion, sweeping up and back from his fine brow. Though he was short of stature, his spirit towered over every man in the room, not least over political hacks sent to greet him, including, as it happened, Machon. Nor was that all that was leonine about the prince. When he laughed, as he did freely, he showed a set of sharp teeth, like that of a young lion. In Alexander's eyes was a real gleam of genius. I particularly recall their different colors, blue on the right, black on the left. The meaning of this feature was never obvious, but seemed to promise a unique destiny, which the prince did easily fulfill. Yet not even this boy could contain the noble spirit within it. That spirit was manifest in the sweetness of odor that seemed to emanate from him wherever he went, bathing his clothes, everything he touched, all around him, even poor Machon, in its perfume. For the first time, Swallow took notice of the figure seated on the defendant's bench. His posture there did not show the theatrical flair of his opponent. He was bent over, shut off as if he wished to disappear. In that position it was impossible to tell if he was short or tall, though from seeing Machon in the assembly years before Swallow remembered, he was of modest height, with curly black hair, kept long in the Lacedaemonian style, so it would flow down from beneath his shoulders helmet. He had a coarse face, with a nose broken to the right. His eyes were also black, but not dull. Instead, they shined in that way only the darkest eyes could, from some combustion of personality within. Or rather, they shined a dozen years earlier, before he left for Asia with Alexander. As Aeschines spoke, Machon stared at the floorboards immediately before him, showing no reaction. He was so passive, in fact, that Swallow wondered if the magnitude of the event had overwhelmed him. The stakes were very high. Conviction on a charge of impiety carried a mandatory sentence of death, while violation of the Assembly's trust carried an indeterminate penalty, but would at least include confiscation of his ancestral property. For Aeschines, the risk was only to his career. Failure to get at least 1/5 of the vote for conviction would earn him a fine of 10 minas and permanent forfeiture of his right to bring prosecutions in the future. He went on. But we may well ask, who is this Machon, son of Agathon? Many of you may believe you know him from his role in public life. You know him as a wealthy man who discharged his liturgies with fair distinction, such as financing a tragedy by Cantharos for the city Dionysia 15 years ago, for which he earned 3rd place. He has rarely spoken in the assembly or the council, and when he has been exclusively about military affairs. He has served no magistracies, although you might recall one event in which he figured as a member of the selectmen some years ago. He was chairman on the day a fire broke out in the warehouse at the Piraeus. While the flames were confined on land, Machon dithered, failing to call out the cadets in sufficient numbers until the fire spread to the fleet offshore. 8 hulls were burned, with damages exceeding 20 talents. Here was an instance where our friend, who affects to have some expertise in the mobilization of men, had an opportunity to display his ability and failed. Perhaps that is why, when he stood for the post of general from his tribe that year, he was rejected overwhelmingly. But knowing Machon as I have come to know him, you would not be surprised at his incapacity. His father, Agathon, was more successful as a public servant, acting twice as naval contractor. Yet the source of his wealth was none too clear. There were persistent stories of vast sums hoarded in the house to avoid additional liturgies. Agathon doled out loans with as little effort as most men put out the condiments at dinner, and exacted interest with ruthless efficiency. Yet where is that fortune now? For certain, Machon has inherited it. So are third-rate theatrical productions all your legacy can muster, Machon. The people want to know. Of his mother's background, the less said, the better. To claim she was a woman of questionable repute would be an exaggeration. It would be more accurate to call her a common whore. Her face, or shall I say several other choice aspects of her anatomy, were nightly spectacles at the sacred gate. After enjoying her with his friends at some low establishment, Agathon further amused himself by purchasing her freedom. This was not to actually set her free, of course, but to increase his pleasures by placing her in debt to him. That he debased himself by proceeding to marry her was only the final act of a long, sad farce. The sequel was our friend, the defendant. As I have shown you, he cuts a fair diminished figure on the public stage than his father, but in one sense he is a chip off the old block. Shortly before departing for Asia, Machon threw a party for his friends in the city that to this day remains infamous. The evening started innocently enough, they say, but by the cracking of the fifth crater, Machon brought in a very pretty freeborn Corinthian boy, ostensibly to play the harp. The skill of the boy's play, it is said, made the guards' guests very excited at his talent, and there were demands for kisses from every quarter. The boy was respectable, however, a musician only. At this, Machon flew into a rage, screaming that he had been cheated. He struck the boy across the face and threw him to the floor. There was alas nothing the poor creature could do to escape, as the servants had barred the doors, and the face-drunken Machon is a frightful thing indeed. Nor did the defendant's accomplices object to this behavior. On the contrary, they might best be likened to a pack of ravaging jackals surrounding the prone boy, lasciviously stripping him of his tunic. Machon ordered his footman to the barn to fetch horsewhips, and for the rest, well, you can imagine it. Together the host and his guest amused themselves, defiling the boy's tender skin, making their own kind of music out of his screams. Of this episode I will say nothing more. Search your memories, and you will recall rumors of it. Swallow looked inquisitively at Deuterus, who tossed his head in a negative. Neither had heard such a story involving Machon. Neither had heard such a story involving Machon, though tales of similar incidents would circulate in Athens every few years. Neither had heard such a story involving Machon, though tales of similar incidents would circulate in Athens every few years. Whether Aeschines' recitation of it did any harm to the defendant's cause was not clear. Its effective seemed merely to pique the jury's interest, sending amused murmurs through the room. Machon, for his part, gave only a single response, looking up with raised brow as Aeschines called his mother a whore. Then he went back to examining the floor. You see, therefore, that the substance of the charges are not without foundation in the defendant's dissipated past. Even so, I declare that Machon deserves to indulge his cynicism, his hateful politics, and his vices, as any man should be free to keep his gluttonies in private. Where I strenuously object, is where such men are placed in positions where their foolishness may engender the welfare of the city, and indeed, in this case, the welfare of all Greeks. That Machon was insinuated in just such a position was not the choice of any man in this room, but was foisted upon us by a faction of dangerous fanatics who gave little thought to the consequences of their designs. Their motive was hatred only, and the result may yet be disaster. I am pledged to expose them by the gods, but to do so I will require more time, and this I humbly request. Polycletus made a mark on the wax tablet before him. Your request is recognized and is so granted. If the prosecution agrees to adhere to the relevant charges only, Aeschines put his hand on his heart. To that I do swear. Reset the clock, please. Three. Has the world ever seen the like of Alexander? Was there ever a man whose endeavors were more certainly blessed by the gods? For have the Greeks not lived in fear of another Persian invasion since Xerxes was driven from our shores? Did the Greeks in Ionia, in Ephesus, Miletus, Assos, Priene, not groan under tyrants installed by Persia? Did we all not grow up, age, and die under the shadow of the monstrosity we called the Great King? No more. The Persian Empire, the client satrapies, the danger they represented to Athens, all have been swept aside. Alexander accomplished it, and indeed did it in about the time it took our ancestors to reduce the single city of Troy. Before Alexander, such a feat was not something any of us would have dared dream. How long did Greeks speak of uniting at last to remove this threat? How many fine speeches were made? How many eloquent pamphlets were published? But we have seen that speeches and pamphlets cannot accomplish such labors. Only men like Alexander can. Remember that Athens fought his leadership, and in her jealousy remained an open sewer of plots and schemes, while he was in Asia fighting for the Greeks, yet we have all derived the benefits of his conquest. Never again will the great king connive with Lacedaemonians and Illyrians and Scythians against us. Neither again will the Ionian ports be closed to our trade. Never again will our grain supplies from the Black Sea be threatened from the flank. Proud Athens, can you not accept a boon so unexpectedly, but so graciously delivered? Can you not rejoice? There never was a better champion of mankind, never a brighter light among the barbarians. With Alexander, anything was possible. India trembled at his approach, and would have fallen into his hands, as no doubt would Carthage, Italy, Sicily. His empire would have stretched to both shores of the boundless ocean, a vast common home for the Greeks that would have made our city the queen of the world. I say, would have, because Alexander is dead, having understood what he accomplished and the promise of his coming reign. You might well ask how this hero, this young god, who was so favored in heaven, could have died in a manner so untimely at the age of 32. You might wonder whether the hand of a weak petty man was implicated in the murder of the future. And you might ask, what does all this have to do with our friend Machon? What exactly was the nature of his impiety? Listen then, and I will tell you. Machon was present at Chaeronea. Of his conduct there, I have no independent report except that he was captured and at the mercy of Philip, was returned to Athens along with 2,000 other prisoners. Upon his release, an inquiry was conducted on the reasons for the defeat. As one of the most senior officers to survive that day, Machon appeared before the subcommittee of the assembly. His testimony was most remarkable. We have his whole speech here. It is a tedious document, too long to read today, which is unfortunate because it says much about the character of the man. At its essence, it is a tissue of rancorous, unsubstantiated accusations, blaming the disaster on our generals, our soldiers, our equipment, our allies, in short, on everything and everyone except Machon himself. There is one section, however, that is most relevant to the charges under consideration. Please read it. The clerk took up the transcript. For the reasons I have described, it will be most difficult to defeat this enemy. Our city cannot make the changes necessary to meet the Macedonians on equal terms, such as foundation of a permanent professional army, as this would require changes in our system of government that would be repugnant to the citizenry. In the future, more suitable methods than direct confrontation will have to be employed if this chronic threat to Athens is to be removed. I pledge myself ready to assist in this project in any way I can. Aeschines turned to address Machon directly. It is a continual wonder how some men roar with courage in peacetime, but bleat with pessimism at the first reverse. What do you mean, Machon, that Athens cannot meet the enemy on equal terms? Do you impugn the courage of our fallen comrades? Can the sons of Erechtheus fight only with fennel stalks? Do they bleed breast milk? This claim of Athens' inferiority should embarrass you as it did the committee which rejected your outburst. Note the key phrase. He says, more subtle methods than direct confrontation will have to be employed if this threat to Athens is to be removed. What can he mean? What other method, other than the clash of arms on the battlefield, would be worthy of men? Are we to resort to womanish scheming at every setback? To be sure, I doubt that anyone took his words seriously. They could not, in fact, because Machon was not punished for his foolishness. The inspiration for Macon's brave call for subterfuge is not hard to guess. Shortly after, Demosthenes went around the city boasting that he had a vision directly from Zeus that Philip had died. Such a partisan invocation of a god would have seemed merely typical of the man's inveterate selfishness, and would have been dismissed as such until word reached Athens that indeed Philip had been assassinated. As the king entered the theater at Aegae on the occasion of his daughter's wedding, he was stabbed by a retainer. All Greece was stunned by the news, leaving aside the proposition that Zeus signals his intentions to Demosthenes alone. How he happened to learn of this event before anyone else in the city, even before mounted messengers could reach Attica, is a mystery. But in light of Macon's call for underhanded tactics against Philip, Demosthenes' connivance in his murder makes perfect sense. On the death of his father, Alexander was bequeathed a kingdom whose rule would have challenged the powers of any mortal man. It stretched from the banks of the Danube to Thessaly, and from the Balkans to Byzantium. Thinking the new king, a mere youth of 20, could not match the skill and determination of the old opportunist, incited rebellions among the tribes of Illyria, in Greece proper, and among the Thebans, and here in Attica. What shame will ever adhere to the cynical enterprise that civilized men of Thebes and Athens, who had duly sworn to respect the leadership of the king in Pella, would attach the fate of Athens to skin-clad barbarians? For had we not agreed, as did all the cities of Greece except Sparta, to aid Philip in his plan to humble the great king? The pact was made in Corinth, shortly after Chaeronea, the terms of which I hold right here in my hand. Take note of the parties stipulated in the agreement. It says the Greeks will respect the captaincy of Philip and his descendants. Could anything be more clear? Could any perfidy be more obvious than the course urged by the anti-Macedonians, who managed again to put Athens on a war footing, on course for another disaster? Note that the purpose of the Corinth alliance was to avenge Greece against the Persians. It demanded nothing of Athens, no booty, no levies, no garrison in our city. Philip expected only our trustworthiness, which one would think would be the least onerous demand on honest men. But instead, Demosthenes, Hyperides, Chaeronea, and their rabble seduced the assembly with talk of overthrowing the boy, of marching all the way to Pella. What hubris! What rubbish! And with what dismay did these cowards watch as Alexander wasted no time in reducing the Illyrians. Not only did he defeat their forces within the boundaries of his kingdom, but he contrived to float his army across the Danube on skin boats and exact the pledges of the tribes beyond. Was this not impressive campaigning for a mere boy? And then, even more shockingly, Alexander marched south through Thermopylae and put Thebes to the torch before Demosthenes could even clear his golden throat. Demosthenes called me a mere child when we marched on Illyria, Alexander said to his troops, and just a youth when I came through Thessaly. I guarantee that when he sees me beneath the walls of Athens, it will be as a man. Naturally, plans for our glorious march on Pella were forgotten. Instead of an army, the anti-Macedonians set out pledges of eternal fealty. Demosthenes himself volunteered to lead the peace delegation to Alexander's camp. He was hailed for his bravery, and after accepting these encomiums, for when has he ever refused cheap acclaim, he rode out of the city in triumph and then slunk away. We had every reason to expect the worst from Alexander. From the slopes of Hymettus, we could see the glow of Thebes burning. There was talk of gathering the fleet, of evacuating the people, of refounding the city elsewhere. This talk, too, was rubbish because it took no account of the divine character of this new king, who never made a move toward Attica. Instead, he only asked for a recommitment to the Corinth Pact, and for the detention of the worst of the demagogues. The later stipulation was not even passed. Demosthenes was spared. At this, even the most rabid of Alexander's enemies were taken aback. Was this the leader against which Athens had so treacherously plotted? When had Athens herself ever showed such mercy to a rebellious subject of her empire? Yet the contrition of these zealots lasted only as long as the Macedonian army was in Boeotia. Having disposed of the father, they turned against the son. Unfortunately for them, Alexander was too quick a target, moving with his army the length and breadth of his kingdom, as I have already described to you. Thereafter, the young king took up his father's project of invading Asia. This campaign alone should have refuted the absurd claims of Demosthenes and his faction, as Alexander did not linger long enough in Greece to tax, oppress, enslave, or otherwise afflict anybody. But instead of at last putting aside their hatred of Alexander, they merely hatched an even more subtle plan to, as Machon demanded, remove this chronic threat. It is obvious now their solution was a kind of Trojan horse. Athens, like most of the other big cities, sent ships and troops to support the expedition to Persia. A ground force of 1,000 landless citizens, outfitted by emergency decree from the Phaeoric Fund, was organized. Machon, at the instigation of Demosthenes, was placed in command of this force. I was not present in the assembly when this decision was made. All I can say about it is that it is a prime example of the burden under which our democracy labors, when strong personalities can undo a manifestly correct policy, and in this case subvert it utterly. How else may we understand the appointment of Machon to his command when his prejudice had been made so very clear in his Chaeronea testimony? We may forgive the more honorable among us for their naivete, believing perhaps that this was an instance of mere cronyism on Demosthenes' part, when in fact the design was still more sinister. Machon even had the audacity to raise his hand and lie in the face of the assembly when his orders were laid out. At every point, the intent of his orders was clear. Machon was to support Alexander in any way within his power. The effect of the deployment was to bring honor on Athens by any means practicable. Obviously, these orders applied as much to Machon as to any hoplite in the ranks. Machon himself was responsible for their commission. Yet we all know the end of Alexander's story, of his premature death in Babylon under such suspicious circumstances. We likewise know that Machon's master, Demosthenes, was not above accomplishing by conspiracy what he could not on the battlefield. And so I must pose the questions. Did Machon support Alexander by any way within his power? Did his conduct bring honor to Athens? If your answers to these questions comport at all with the truth laid before you, then you already have your verdict on the second charge of violating the sacred trust of his orders. The Athenian expeditionary force was presented to Alexander at his camp. With some justification, considering the legacy of Athenian deceit cultivated by the anti-Macedonians, the king declined to accept our contingent into his army. What a stunning dishonor for Athenian arms, to be left on the shore at the outset of the greatest campaign ever to leave Greece. But all was not lost for Machon and his scheming sponsors. Alexander, the ever-mindful, salvaged the honor of our city by accepting one Athenian, Machon, into his inner circle of companions. It was his fatal misfortune that his magnanimity was wasted on such a man. It seems that Machon did not owe his position on Alexander's staff to his knowledge of military matters, but to his pen. This is curious. I am aware of no one who can attest to the defendant's competence as a historian. Machon has neither recited nor published anything of consequence. We may well imagine, then, the torrent of lies he must have told Alexander to convince him of his talent. On this point in particular, more than any vain protestations of his innocence, I am most interested to hear the defendant's statement. The invasion began. Alexander was the first to leap ashore on the Asian side, claiming it all as his spear-won territory and proceeding thence to the ruins of Troy. Wits back home chuckled at the story that he honored his ancestor Achilles with sacrifices under the ravaged battlements. They laughed when they heard that Alexander and his favorite Hephaestion, stripped naked, anointed each other with oil, and ran around the citadel 7 times. They ridiculed him outright for his presumption to borrow the armor of Achilles from the temple of Athena. Sophisticates far and wide scorn the king's reverence for history, but sophisticates don't win wars. The effort of these rites on his troops was inspirational. Would that more Greeks today be a bit more reverent and a bit less sophisticated? What the gods thought of Alexander's obsequies was evidence in his first encounter with troops in Darius's employ. I say in his employ rather than Persian troops, because the greater part of the enemy was composed of Greek mercenaries. And here again, we see evidence of the decline of honor of our race, that matters have come to such a pass that Greeks would take gold to defend a barbarian kingdom. By all evidence, Alexander understood this as well as Darius in the end. Persians alone could never carry the field against him. Only Greeks can ever defeat Greeks. The first battle was joined beneath Mount Ida's lowering hills. On the far side of the Granicus River, the Greeks faced an army almost as large as theirs, barring their way on high banks as strong and secure as the castle. In front were the Persian horsemen on their baleful steeds, cased in armored skins that shone in the afternoon sun. Scimitars and javelins solemnly crossed upon their chests, behind crowded and upturned pikes of 20,000 Greek mercenaries. At this sight, a pall of misgiving spread over Alexander's army, for they would not only have to defeat the arrayed host of their enemy, but the swift current of the river. Parmenion, a veteran general, counseled the king to delay his attack until morning. The position of the enemy, he said, was impregnable. The banks of the river, he warned, were treacherous, so that even if a crossing could be managed in the stream, the Greeks would never find purchase on the muddy slopes as they fought uphill against mounted foes. These were wise words to be heeded by any leader of merely mortal stature. Philip himself might have accepted them. All looked to Alexander, who said nothing at first, but seemed lost in thought, as if unable to make a decision. But when he finally spoke, it was the words of the poet that came out. He sang, "And the silvered fish did swirl and bite the tender flesh of newly dead Lycaon. You Trojans will die to a man as I fight. Too far, Ilium's hallowed towers. Run you might, my swift blade will try your backs. No escape for those who cower beneath the swirling surge of Scamander. No sacrifice, no blooded bull on cobbled bank, or fair-manned horse cast in the river, will save them now dressed in pain, until the price in blood is settled for Patroclus and the Greeks slain, beside the big ships while I was away." The Greeks' response to this, at first, nothing. The words were familiar enough to them, of course, but only as part of a story. Alexander would use the words to write his own epic, studying them at night from the school copy of the Iliad he always kept under his pillow. He deployed Homer's lines like files of soldiers, crying as Achilles fought the wide Scamander, may we churn this stream with our greaves. And with that, they say, he was gone, charging down the near bank. Four. Several hours later, and with the exhaustion of Swallow's entire supply of cheese, Aeschines at last seemed to be winding down his presentation. With Alexander's passage, the world paused. They say that a shadow passed over Babylon that day, and with it the sound of great wings rustling. Far away to the west, over Siwa, an eagle was seen wheeling over the Ammon temple. The very same hour, the priest attest, another eagle flew into the Zeus sanctuary at Dodona, coming to rest in the great oak of the oracle there. The bird stayed there for some time, calling plaintively, as if for a lost brother, until it took wing again into the mountains. Finally, and again, on the same day, the keepers of Zeus's altar at Dion saw a great eagle come out of the east, swooping down to the altar. It dropped a laurel wreath from its talons, circled 7 times, then ascended home to the eyrie of divine Olympus. For it was on that spring day, during the archonship of Hagezes, in Athens, just shy of the 33rd year of his age, that the great Alexander died. Aeschines paused, but not to wet his throat. He just stood there for several moments, his head bowed, shoulders slumped. Just as the jury became restless, he resumed speaking again, in a voice that was very small, yet somehow carried to the very back of the courtroom. That the king died of poison, I take as granted. After his second and third marriages, his first wife, Rogane, had reason to want him dead, and ample opportunity to make him so. You recall that the Babylonians had a taster sample the water she brought in to him. While it is true that this man did not die after he drank, he did suffer later from acute pains of the abdomen. Whatever caused these pains might not have been fatal to a healthy man, but could easily have been deadly to someone who was already weak with sickness. For as we all know, wise poisoners do not strike out of the blue, but wait for some natural illness to cover their handiwork. You may judge this woman's motives and character by what happened the very day Alexander died. Rogane forged a letter in the king's name to his second wife, Barsine, ordering her to attend him in Babylon. This letter reached Susa before news of his death was known there. When Barzine trustingly submitted to the royal escort, which was really a gang of thugs in Rogane's employ, she was murdered. Like Rogane, she was carrying a child of Alexander's. Please understand that I do not mean to play the partisan in the current dispute over the succession. With regard to her motives and Machaon's, it need only be said that Rogane has since delivered a boy, and that the child now figures in this matter in a way he never would have had Barzine lived. Of Alexander himself, I will say no more. I have eulogized him enough for the purposes of this prosecution. Suffice it to say that the world will never again see his like, and that he was too soon taken from us, Jealous men say he was flawed, and that they are surely right, for whatever was divine in him, as in us all, was inevitably mixed with that which makes us mortal. I never said he was perfect, I only said he was a god. Machon will surely attempt some sophistic assault on the charges we make against him. He will argue that it is impossible for a mortal man like himself to corrupt a divine being. For the record, I will say that I believe Machon to be a devious weakling who would not by himself have destroyed Alexander. My claim, rather, is that he was a corrupting influence who consistently worked to undermine that which was good in the man and encouraged that which was destructive. I remind you that Machon does not stand charged with killing Alexander. Rather, the good people of Athens accused of him of impiety before a god, and of violating his orders to support Alexander in a manner that would bring honor to this city. Athenians, tell me, having heard his story, do you feel yourself covered with honor? With all that I have placed in evidence, it is perhaps worth recounting the many ways Machon betrayed your trust. At Sardes, he lied about his association with Demosthenes, who was a known enemy of Macedon. At Gordium, he encouraged Alexander's ambition to untie the celebrated knot, provoking him to take a risk that only the kings subtly overcame. After Issus, he encouraged Alexander to abuse his captive. Satyra, before the siege of Tyre, he was defeatist. In Egypt, we know by his own words that he plotted against Alexander's defect. At the Susian gates, he baited the king into what he believed was a foolish mistake, only to be confounded when Alexander succeeded in forcing the gates anyway. At Maracanda, he goaded the king into killing his friend Clitus, and boasted that he encouraged Alexander to believe that any offense would be considered just in the eyes of heaven. In that same letter to Demosthenes, he further rejoices at Alexander's breakdown. We know, based on a letter that Machon wrote from Sogdia, that he intended to use Rogane to further his designs. We also have material evidence that he received money from the thief Harpalus, payable in Persian currency. Lastly, and most faithfully, we know that he actively encouraged Rogane to fear Alexander's intentions. In this, he as good as encouraged her to act against him. Aeschines struck up a rhythm that became almost a dance, shifting from one foot to the other, as he ran through these points. Swallow and the rest of the jury rocked with him, very entertained, until he brought them up short with a final dramatic indictment. In the life of our democracy, so much of our time seems consumed by trivialities, and it might seem that our dispute with Machon is over little more than minor matters. Words said at the wrong time, in the wrong place, or left unsaid. The petty boast of a small man temporarily enlarged by circumstances he neither deserved nor comprehended. Of Alexander's vices and virtues you may believe what you wish, as he is not on trial here. It is this man, Machon, we gather to judge, in the light of the responsibilities he solemnly accepted, as an agent of the city. And I say that in the discharge of such responsibilities, none of us here, magistrate, juror, prosecutor, or defendant, is entitled to judge which are the important charges to keep and which are trivialities. Our forefathers have made those decisions for us. I would expect the same standard to be applied to myself if I were in Machaon's position. You will shortly hear from the defendant himself. Though he plays the laconic soldier, don't be fooled. He is as subtle as any con artist in the Stoa, as skilled with words as he is useless with the tools of war. He has his work cut out for him, however, considering that Alexander is untimely dead, and Machon was sworn to serve Athens by serving Alexander. It seems he has but two choices. He must either admit his malice or plead utter incompetence. In neither case does he escape his guilt. I therefore beg that you hear his plea and judge it with the wisdom that is worthy of our legacy as Athenians. That done, I cannot doubt that justice, which is our only purpose today, will be served. Aeschines finished exactly as the last drop of water ran through the clock. This impressed sophisticated jurors as much as anything he said, for it was difficult to accomplish this feat without making one's speech detectably stretched or truncated. Turning to look at his colleagues, Swallow could see in their eyes that the verdict on Aeschines was already in. His was a most impressive return. "The clock is set for a quarter-hour recess," the clerk announced. The jurymen used a latrine reserved for them in the alley behind the courthouse. This was a blind wall with a stone-cut channel flushed by running water. As he took his place in line, Swallow always found himself contemplating the nooks and chinks knocked into the masonry, wondering at the generations of jurors who had thus pissed their way to a kind of immortality. The deeper the impressions he gathered, the more long-winded the advocates. For his part, Swallow preferred style to power, attempting to write his name on the wall as he listened to the reviews of the trial so far. "I'd hate to be that Machon right now, poor bastard," someone said. "Serves him right with that haircut. But he stayed quiet for most of it. That's more than I would have stood for. Aeschines handled him acquittal with that crap. There was not a bit of substance to it. That's what makes it good. It was delivered for the courtroom, not the schoolroom. This is more about politics than the law. That was more about the prick Alexander than anything else. An overuse of enthymenes. I've never seen them so liberal with the clock. Somebody wants this guy dead. If his speech takes more than 2 hours, I'll want him dead. I give up honors to the lamb." Ha 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 ha. Dutras was standing at Swallow's elbow as he wrapped himself, sucking his lower lip. "I guess I don't see any reason to change our vote," he said. "Why would we?" replied Swallow. "The defense hasn't spoken yet. Do you think it'll matter?" It will to me. Give me that bread." "So what does Swallow say about the trial?" someone asked. Others seconded the question until every face was turned toward Swallow. As one of the most experienced jurymen, he was presumed to have seen and heard it all since the dictatorship of the 30. Swallow knew this was an exaggeration. He wasn't that old, but didn't exactly discourage their esteem either. "I am surprised at nothing from Aeschines," he said, "except perhaps the timing of his prosecution. Why does he bring the charges now, so soon after Machon has come back?" Why did he not wait until more witnesses returned from the East so he could present live testimony? I am never comfortable with indicting a man on the basis of something in a letter. The jurors stood pensively at their through. Swallow continued, I think that what we were expected to understand was not in the speech at all, and the winner, if the verdict is guilty, will not be Aeschines. The silence lasted a bit longer, as his fellow citizens took his meaning, or realized they never would. The argument then resumed as to which school of rhetorical style Aeschines' speech was best classified. When they returned to their seats, the man who brought the lamb was still unconscious on the floor. He had missed the entire prosecution and looked comfortable enough lying there to miss the defense too. There was a certain fairness in this, it seemed. Aeschines was sitting now with a plate of figs and myrtle berries. He ate with his eyes glued to Machon, who likewise had not moved, but sat staring narrowly at his feet, as if refusing to gratify his opponent by glaring back. As the clerk gavelled the courtroom to order the defendant finally, looked up, his eyes sweeping over the mob that would decide his fate. Though Swallow believed Aeschines' case was a tissue of presumption and innuendo, he said one thing that was clearly true. Machon had his work cut out for him. Having considered the case for the indictment, said Polyclitus, the court will now hear the defense. Does the defendant wish to speak? I claim that privilege, said Machon, rising. He turned out to be short. So short, in fact, many of the jurors in the back of the room would not see him at all. His voice also had a much higher pitch than one would imagine from his martial appearance. Very well. You have the usual measure of time. For a moment, Machon did not speak, but just stood there, with his palms turned upward, as if to beseech heaven, or to express his wonderment at the mess Aeschines had placed before them all. There were a few titters from the left side of the room, toward which Machon, in a clever gesture of confidence, actually winked. Swallow glanced at the Macedonians in the spectators' box. They were scowling. All this suddenly filled Swallow with anticipation. He leaned over to Deuterus. This might be something, he whispered. "5. Alexander dead? Impossible. His corpse would fill the world with its stank. Demades, Athenian orator. Well then, what a performance! This prosecution was well worth the wait for Aeschines' return from abroad. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm excited to vote. Let's convict this Machon. Let's grab the lout and string him up." Machon paused as the jury gave him a good laugh. As much as Swallow enjoyed routine trials, he enjoyed innovative defenses even more. For the speaker was treading dangerous around with this flip tone. If he misstepped, if he alienated enough jurors, it could cost him dearly. The last person to take such a risk was Socrates, when upon his conviction he suggested the penalty of receiving free dinners from the state for the rest of his life. This piece of wit, such as it was, so irked his jury that it earned him a lopsided vote for death. This was not a promising legal precedent for Machon. Whether or not he could pull it off, no one could deny. His tack was most entertaining, like an acrobat working without a net. Unfortunately, I don't think I can help you find Aeschines Machon, because I don't know him. That Machon is a scheming scoundrel. This Machon is nothing more than a simple soldier who, like many of the men in this room, but not you, Aeschines, fought for his country at Chaeronea. Aeschines describes a man full of hubris. This Machon lives as modestly as his weakness may allow, pays his taxes, and contributes to the governance of his city, like all of you. Aeschines invents someone who is hip-deep in political faction. This Machon belongs to no faction at all. He has no ambition to matter more than he does. True, he rarely takes the myrtle wreath in the assembly, and only when speaking on military affairs. But it is only because this Machon restricts his public statements to things he knows something about, unlike, apparently, the celebrated Aeschines. Indeed, the orator left out what may be considered the defendant's proudest achievements in politics. A decree of the assembly, passed by unanimous voice vote, that all used equipment from broken-up naval vessels should be offered first to the public contractors before it is claimed by fishermen and other private interests. This motion has saved the taxpayers thousands of drachma in replacement costs. So while Aeschines may demand to know where my father's money is, I remind him that I have helped keep the public's money where it belongs. So the first question is, why are we here, really? Why was this action brought against so insignificant a figure? There are at least two easy answers to the question. The first, I suggest, is fear. The death of Alexander has raised the hopes of those who would resist Macedonian power. Others are afraid that Athens will meet the same end as Thebes, if it comes to armed conflict. No point in Greece is more than 2 weeks' march away for Antipater's army. There is a need for an example to be made here, a sacrifice of someone supposed to be connected with the anti-Macedonian faction to prove that Athens is not a threat. The second reason is simple revenge. Of Aeschines' antagonism towards Demosthenes, I need not elaborate. He had stooped before to attacking Demosthenes' friends in lieu of the man himself. You may prove it to yourself when Aeschines publishes his prosecution, as he always does. Count how many times he makes reference to Demosthenes. The exercise will be very revealing. It might move you to ask who is really on trial here, though it is my neck that is in the noose. But there is a large, less obvious reason. It is this, O Athens. There is something wrong in our city. We can all sense it. We feel the pull of events and feel we must do something, but every way we turn raises howls of protest, or grave danger, or unpredictable consequences. It is as if we are at the top of a small mountain with a chasm all around us, and higher peaks beyond. We want to go higher, but we fear to take the steep path on the way, so we cling to where we are. And we admire men like Alexander, whom we, in our childish faith, believe would defy all limits. I don't say these things to prove I am cleverer than anyone else. I observe them as a man who has been too long away from home and spent at least a part every day thinking about how he would get back. Sometimes fresh eyes give the clearest view. I wonder if my opponent agrees with me, so soon back from his own exile. Does this feel like the same city you left, Aeschines? Be honest. I understand that the hegemony of Alexander is not remembered as a time of glory here, but of hunger and shortage. Yet how quickly some are willing to overlook the misery caused by his wars. Early in your statement you said something about Alexander's good looks making slaves of men. I agree with you that slaves were made in Athens. I'm just not sure it was his beauty that did that trick. I will pass over in silence the bulk of my opponent's calumnies, except to say that his sensibilities notwithstanding, my mother was indeed a freed woman, and my father's love for her was not a farce. Of wild parties and whipping boys he lets me off easily, as he presents not the slightest shred of evidence. Not that he has ever let the small problem get in the way of a rousing argument. Such lies are therefore nothing to me. The wise man, as they say, is content to let asses bray. I trust members of the jury have been around this barnyard enough to know where to step. As I see it, all that matters are the charges. Aeschines and his sponsors accuse me of impiety, because they have gotten wind of some alleged acts of mine in the East that suggest that I treated Alexander like a man, not a god. They also charge me with violating my oath to the assembly, because I pledged to help Alexander, and he ended up, well, closer to the gods than when he began. I mean, imagine that. A soldier dying on campaign. More laughter and more nervous shuffling by Polycletus and the Macedonians. Aeschines, for his part, was drawing his cloak around him like a tortoise taking to his shell. In any case, Aeschines says, I must either confess to malice or to incompetence. But he forgets a third alternative, failure in good faith. Yes, I did fail to flatter Alexander's pretensions to divinity, and yes, I did fail to save him from the consequences of his own contradictions. If these be actionable crimes, then I accept my guilt without further contest. But I would also point out that if simple failure were grounds for prosecution of our magistrates, then courts like this would never adjourn. Now the jury was expecting Machon to be funny, erupting before he could finish his punchlines. Polycletus made a flicking gesture at the clerk, who banged the floor with his staff until order was restored. The defendant is directed to refrain from mocking these proceedings. This is not a burlesque. My apologies. I also ask the jury to forgive me, for I get ahead of myself. My point is only that my conduct was appropriate to the circumstances of the campaign, and that I did serve the king in the best way I could. Athens need not fear for her honor, for in those times there was dishonor enough to go around for all. But to show this, I must tell you what really happened on campaign with Alexander. Some of you will be surprised at what you will hear of this. Most likely, you have never heard the truth, and never will again, for my history is not a felicitous not as felicitous as that of poor Callisthenes, or of the other second-rate scribblers who have sprouted from the gore and ash Alexander spread from here to India. My story begins at Chaeronea. Like many of you, I traveled to the battle with all the joy of a groom about to see his bride unwrapped. To have all the tension of those years, all the uncertainty in our confrontation with Macedon, suddenly cast aside, filled all of us with a love for our city that was all-sustaining. Patriotism, we believed, would be our food on the march and for desert victory. Recall the sight: 20,000 Athenians in the rusty armor of their grandfathers, hayseeds and city boys streaming into the crossroads, greeting each other like reunited kin. The old man mustered for the last time with steely gaze and hands trembling on the pikes, taking the kisses of young women on the roadsides. We were off to Boeotia, the theater of so many other battles that Theban Epaminondas rightly called it. The dancing floor of war. And like the Thebans facing down Spartan power at Leuctra, the Athenians were coming at last to dance with King Philip and his detested Macedonians. Our campfires spread for miles up the road by night. We bivouacked without sentries, without order, and without care. There were rumors that a man named Stratocles was in charge. He was a strategical genius, they said, and he had a plan to rout the Macedonians, who were much due for humbling. A drink to victory, and another to Stratocles, and more after that, until the fires were superfluous, and we danced away whatever energy the march had left to us. The Joy Division reached Thebes and streamed around her walls, thinking the Theban army would come out to embrace their new allies. But the gates stayed shut, and the guards in the towers looked down on us warily. On the far side of the city, we saw a neat square of armored men waiting on the road. It was not the whole Theban army, but the best part of it. We had the Theban sacred band on our side, 300 strong. Since the days of Pelopidas, this band had never lost a battle. They fought as couples, each man consecrated to his lover in the ranks. It was a coup for Demosthenes to have convinced the Thebans to plight this, their most cherished unit, in their cause. What need then of strategy, tactics, security? On to victory, and then on to Macedon, to smash the half-barbarian upstarts who presumed to enslave true Greeks. The only sour note was struck by the Thebans. Though undefeated in more than a generation, they marched diffidently, without joy or confidence on their faces. Some thought they felt dishonored to share the road with us. We might have suspected that they had a better idea of the quality of the opposition. Our scouts sighted the enemy in a narrow valley in the north of Boeotia. From that moment, the events of the day became a blur to me. Stratocles, it turned out, had no strategy in mind. Officers from different units came scurrying up to organize us into phalanxes, 8 shields deep, then 16, then back to 8. First we stood there, then we stood there. An order went out to march forward onto the plain, but the command went to only half the army, leaving big gaps in our lines. The mood passed from happiness to frenzy, as everyone wanted something done, but no one was clearly in charge, and the gaps infuriated the officers, who yelled at the gallant but frustrated boys and the old men. With these annoyances, we became aware that we were footsore, and though we had feasted on patriotism, hungry. The good times on the road gave way to squabbling as men were crushed against each other. The only cool heads were on the shoulders of the Thebans, who marched in precise order to our right flank and settled there, resting their peculiar crimped shields on the ground against their legs. The Macedonians, meanwhile, were collected in their neat ranks, watching us struggle to form our lines. Of our companion cavalry and Philip and Alexander there was yet no sign. Somebody in the vanguard observed that the enemy had just tiny shields hanging from the shoulders, and that they wore only leather armor. A rumor was passed back through the ranks that the Macedonians had no protection at all, and for a moment all discomfort was forgotten, for the enemy had left their shields at Pella, and it would be an easy day of killing for the Greeks. At last they had us all organized and pointed the right direction. I was on the right, adjacent to the sacred band, in the sixth row of phalanx 8 shields deep. I recall it was already late in the day to begin a battle. The sun beat down so mercilessly on my helmet that I could smell the liner cooking within it. To keep their hands dry on their spears, men up and down the line were wiping their sweaty palms on their breastplates, or struggling to bend over for some dirt. At the sounding of the pipes, we marched forward in more or less good order. We were a loud army, clanking with every step, raising the paean. The Macedonians, on the other hand, moved over the battlefield in almost complete silence. The mood became very tense as the armies closed on each other. From many yards away we could see that the Macedonian pikes, their cuirasses, were at least twice as long as the ones we carried. The whooping and hollering on the Greek side subsided. Our lines contracted as each soldier pressed against his comrade to the right, trying to nestle behind his shield. This forced each shield-bearer to move to his right until the whole line began to drift north, angling obliquely toward the enemy. Lacking true shields, our enemies could not hunker behind their fellows, but marched straight and true. Watching them between the shoulders of my comrades, I could see their faces. The Macedonians looked serene, even bored. The enemy halted their advance as our first 3 ranks leveled their spears. Our boys kept on coming, giving throat to the cry that terrified the Persians at Marathon and Plataea. Elelu, Elelu. With that, the Macedonians all turned around and withdrew on the double. There didn't seem to be any sign given for them to do this. They just did it, as calmly as if they were drilling on the parade ground. Unlike at Marathon, our front ranks were not taken up by our toughest hoplites, but by our most enthusiastic. The Macedonian withdrawal confirmed what they had long imagined, that the barbarians had no stomach for fighting, the 3 citizens of a civilized city. Our ranks dissolved as we tried to reach the retreating enemy, weighted down with ancient panoplies. The Greeks exhausted themselves trying to run after the lightly clad Macedonians. Our officers were screaming at their men, trying to organize an orderly advance. Yet our glorious commander, Stratocles, who was very probably drunk, was off celebrating the rout, riding with sword aloft, crying, "We've got 'em on the run, boys. Now on to Pella." With the sole exception of our Theban allies, who anchored our right with no trace of emotion, all semblance of organization among the Greeks was gone. Our army opened up like a boiled onion. The ranks peeled away from the phalanx one by one. Some of the hoplites, half blind with sweat, under ill-fitting helmets, tripped on rocks and clumps of soil. As they struggled to rise, they were trampled in the dust by their jubilant comrades. This was in chilling contrast to the Macedonians, who wheeled around in their thousands without a single man going down. Not a single one. You know what followed? At the sounding of a trumpet, the enemy retreat suddenly seemed to halt. What had really happened, of course, was that the Macedonians didn't run away at all, but had only performed a withdrawal behind a new line formed by their first and best men. Having fooled many of the Greeks with this sham, they grasped their pikes underhand and leveled the tips. The Macedonian pike is long enough for men 4 and 5 shields deep in their phalanx to reach the enemy. Many of the Athenians were propelled by pure momentum into the swarm of spear points. Hemmed in by their comrades around them, hundreds were struck full in the face, noses or jawbones split. This was when I learned that the entrance of a metal point into the unprotected face of a man makes a peculiar noise, a certain combination of a crunch and a thud. I had much opportunity to hear it as the survivors tried to come about, colliding with the oncoming ranks, until we were all a helpless jumble of exhausted blind men and boys so terrified that we shat ourselves with fear or cried for our mothers. It was at this point that the enemy broke their silence. They let loose a cry that I cannot imitate for you. It was made in that strange dialect of theirs, a cry so concertedly made it rose over the ongoing din of shields and armor, freezing the blood of every Greek on the field. The Macedonians then started forward again, walking right over the Greek casualties, finishing off the fallen, with downward thrust of the iron points on the butts of their pikes. I remember seeing a face I recognized among the wounded. He was the teacher who taught me my letters decades before. I had not seen him since, and never did again, but only in an instant. He laid uncomplaining at the feet of the Macedonians. The contents of his testicles spilled on his groin flaps, his gray head anointed with the dust of sacrifice. There was at that point still some distance between the enemy and what remained of the Athenian line. To the eternal credit of my fellow citizens, most of them stood firm as the enemy approached. Others, foreseeing only their imminent death, and finding themselves hemmed in on all sides by the phalanx, gave themselves over to panic. Just a few of these cowards, flailing to free themselves, was enough to disrupt huge swaths of our formation. And all the while the Macedonians were coming on, those damnable, cocksure smiles on their faces, smiles like those right here. Smiles like those right there. Machon leveled a finger at the Macedonian observers in the courtroom, who were indeed grinning as they listened to one of the storied moments in their nation's history. Their smiles withered as 500 pairs of resentful eyes bore down on them. You may be thinking that I paint too dark a picture of the events that day. To those who were not there, it should be pointed out that the battle seemed far from over to us. There was still the opportunity for the Greeks to turn the tables on the enemy, to settle in, dig the butts of our spears into the earth, and impale the dogs as they charged. We were confident we could do this, and prepared for it, for we all understood exactly what was at stake. We had already learned, after all, that there was no defensive strategy against the likes of Philip, no resort to long walls, and hope for bad weather. Can you remember when our grandfathers told us of the war with Sparta, when those half-hick stiffs would come every year at the same time, shake their fist at our long walls, burn a few haystacks, and go home? Remember how formidable those Lacedaemonians sounded to us as children? Yet we all knew we were in for much worse if Philip's hordes poured into Attica. To Philip, walled cities were unshucked oysters, and the war never stopped for harvest, weather or any other reason under heaven. His troops were neither part-time nor rented soldiers, but professionals who made a craft of intimidation, rape, and massacre. There was nothing for us to do then but to put shoulder to shield and push hard against the line. We would accept the hours of exhaustion in our old panoplies, the heat and terror of suffocation, and the panicky spray of our neighbor's urine. We would push and push some more until the Macedonians broke for their mountains at last, and we would bury our spears in the backs of many as we could. But it was not to be. The battle was not over in hours, but minutes, as the Macedonian cavalry somehow broke into our rear guard. Through one of the great gaps in our line, Philip's so-called companions had ridden and commenced to slash at our back rank. The Greek army, it seems, had come that day without any cavalry at all, and so our flanks had no defense. With that, the entire right wing of the Greeks crumpled. Hoplites dropped their spears, tore off their armor, and ran for their lives. The horsemen made them pay for their indiscipline. The deserters were chased down and butchered from behind by the Macedonian aristocrats. These were incidentally quite gaily turned out in their purple cloaks, trimmed with gold, and how they seemed to enjoy the work of slaughtering fathers and grandfathers who came to fight for their children's freedom. As fate would have it, this was not the last time I would watch the Macedonians go about this, their favorite business. Trapped in the center of the disintegrating phalanx, I was being propelled this way and that by waves of flailing, terrified men. Those who have been there know the danger in the crush of armored bodies. It was difficult just to get a breath. Keeping upright was also a challenge, lest I suffer the fate of those trampled under the feet of their comrades. It was at that moment, when I was thus engaged, and I first glimpsed Prince Alexander. I'm not sure how I knew it was him, as I was too far away to see his face. I might have guessed his identity because he was riding at the head of the retinue, or because his cloak had a reversed color scheme, gold trim with purple, or from the fact that he alone wore the Gorgon's head device on his breastplate, or it might have been for the same reason that the sheepdog always stands out from the rest of the flock, the princely way he rode a horse, cantering here and there, directing his forces, pounding his fist for emphasis, gesturing his displeasure over some unfulfilled command. I watched him until I lost sight of him behind an obstacle that I belatedly realized was the sacred band, which was surrounded. The Thebans had formed themselves into a defensive square with their spears presented at every side. Against them the enemy pikemen were forming up in columns 32 shields deep. When they were ready, the Macedonians charged at a run into the Thebans, with the soldiers in their back ranks pushing the ones in front. This kind of attack generated powerful momentum, the kind that drove leveled pikes straight through the armor of stationary men. The Macedonians did this over and over, giving each fresh regiment a crack at the Thebans. The defenders, who had locked shields, were able to hold their own for a while, but they lacked the force of forward movement, and their lances were too short to strike back. Inevitably, when the armor was holed or split, the Thebans began to fall. As each died, his comrade protected his body with his shield, or with his own body, as the case may be. The square gave way as the Macedonians kept up the attack. We Greeks watched with tears in our eyes as the glorious band, its history unblemished by defeat, was ground into the dust. At last, when there was only one stubborn pair left, on what had become their funeral mound, Prince Alexander rode forward on his fabled mount, Bucephalus. Taking aim with his thrusting spear, and in a remarkable bit of horsemanship, he drove right into the morass of dead flesh and speared one of the Thebans straight through his breastplate, with the other resigned to do nothing more than watch. Alexander extracted the spearhead from the body of his companion, backed off a bit, then simply rode the last Theban down. The Macedonians roared as Bucephalus leapt free of the mound, and Alexander unfurled his tawny tresses and raised his bloodied spear in triumph. This was not the end of the day's slaughter. In defiance of custom, Philip's troops massacred retreating Athenians for the rest of the afternoon, chasing them into the hills, into cornfields and granaries, up roofs and down into caves. Yes, the king made a gallant gesture of burning the bodies that were left on the battlefield and delivering the collected ashes to us here. But the bodies of hundreds of others, those who fled, were never recovered or given the proper rites. They were left to rot where they fell. We Athenians, for our part, did not ask awkward questions of the victors, but merely thanked the gods for what we were given. Like many of you, I was at Chaeronea to save my country, but at the risk of encouraging Aeschines' bizarre speculations, I grant I did have an ulterior motive. It had always been my ambition to write a history. You may recall that Thucydides and Xenophon were soldiers and commenced their histories because they foresaw that future generations might learn from an account of the conflicts of their time. I believed, and still do believe, that the same is true of our wars, where Thucydides had his Pericles, Cleon, and Alcibiades. In our time, we have Demosthenes, Philip, and yes, Aeschines. So, while my opponent attempts to make my ambition in this regard appear something dubious, he only shows his own contempt for the craft of history. How many of the men here would take up the pen too if they had the means and the opportunity? To your shame, Aeschines. See how many hands are raised. The defendant may not pose questions to the jury. The judge objected. Your Honor, would that rule apply to questions one might characterize as rhetorical? You may ask rhetorical questions only if you clearly indicate that you don't want your questions to be answered. Eminence, am I to understand that if I ask a rhetorical question and the jury elects to answer, I am to be held responsible for a transgression that I myself have not committed? The jurors broke into heated discussion. Polyclitus glowered red with anger, called for order. It took several moments for the room to quiet again. The defendant will not ask questions, and the jury will not answer. Is that clear enough for you all? Perfectly. I also request additional time due to the interruption. So granted. Go on, please. To resume, I went to Boeotia as a soldier, but also with the eye of a chronicler, as I judged this to be a unique moment in the affairs of men. Fortunately for my project, I was not killed during the battle, but taken prisoner, along with several thousand other Athenians and allies. I was placed in a stockade not far from the Macedonian camp. The pen was just an offhand thing, a corral built of thin sticks and brush, with ditch water to drink. Philip fed us with rotten onions collected from the haversacks of the dead. So famished were the Athenians that they fought over these meager rations. It is a fortunate thing for the men of Asia that Alexander did not inherit his father's cheapness. Having foreseen the advantage of taking notes in the field, I have brought with me several lead tablets and a stylus, which I stored in the cave of my shield. It was at that point, when I had been in detention for 2 days without food, when the stench of the open pit toilets rose to new heights, and rumors flew that we would all be sent to short, miserable careers as slaves in the mines at Mount Pangaeus. But I believed I was sufficiently immersed in my subject to begin composing. I had not gotten far along in recording my impressions of the battle, when a peculiar voice addressed me, asking, "Ye scribe, what dost thou?" Perceiving that the question came from the Macedonian side of the fence, and in the archaic dialect of those backward northerners, I ignored it. A pair of booted feet came into my line of sight, as I peered down at my tablet, and the voice resumed. "Be ye poet or prosophier, O son of Theseus? I will own thine answer." Bowing to the inevitable, I looked up and was confronted with none other than Prince Alexander himself.